Section 6 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added The Court of King Charles, by Anthony Weldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Court of King James, Part 5.
Now are in hold the Earl, his Countess, Sir Thomas Monson, Mistress Turner, a very lewd and infamous woman of life,
Weston and Franklin, with some others of less note,
of which one Simon, a servant to Sir Thomas Monson, who was employed in carrying jelly and tart to the Tower, who upon his examination for his pleasant answer was instantly dismissed. My lord told him, "Simon, you have had a hand in this poisoning business." He replied, "No, my good lord, I had but one finger in it, which almost cost me my life, and at the best cost me all my hair and nails." For the truth was, Simon was somewhat liquorish, and finding the syrup swim from the top of a tart as he carried it, he did with his finger scum it off.
And it was to be believed, had he known what it had been, he would not have been his taster at so dear a rate.
And that you may know Simon's interest with that family, I shall tell you a story. Sir Thomas Monson was a great lover of music, and had as good as England had, especially for voices,
and was at infinite charge in breeding some in Italy.
This Simon was an excellent musician, and did sing delicately, but was a more general musician than ever the world had, and in one kind he surpassed all. He had a catser of an immense length and bigness, with this being his tabor stick, his palm of his hand his tabor, and his mouth his pipe. He would so imitate a tabor and pipe as if it had been so indeed. To this music would Mrs. Turner, the young ladies, and some of that king, dance ever after supper. The old lady, who loved that music as well as her daughters, would sit and laugh. She could scarce sit for laughing, and it was believed that some of them danced after that pipe without the tabor. His master, coming to hear of it, turned him away, who was infinitely importuned to take him again, but would not. However, he could not have wanted a service elsewhere, but he never durst use his pipe amongst them for their dancing recreation, however he might for any other. And now poor Mrs. Turner, Weston, and Franklin began the tragedy, Mrs. Turner's day of mourning being better than the day of her birth, for she died very penitently, and showed much modesty in her last act, which it is to be hoped was accepted with God. After that died Weston, and then was Franklin arraigned, who confessed that Overbury was smothered to death, not poisoned to death, though he had poison given him. Here was cook glad how to cast about to bring both ends together, Mrs. Turner and Weston being already hanged for killing Overbury with poison, but he, being the very quintessence of law, presently informs the jury that if a man be done to death with pistols, poniards, swords, halter, poison, etc., so he be done to death, the indictment is good,
if but indicted for any of those ways.
But the good lawyers of those times were not of that opinion, but did believe that Mrs. Turner was directly murdered by my Lord Cook's law, as Overbury was without any law. In the next place comes the Countess to her trial,
at whose arraignment, as also at Mrs. Turner's before, were showed many pictures, puppets, etc., with some exorcisms and magic spells,
which made them appear more odious, as being known to converse with witches and wizards. And amongst those tricks Foreman's book was showed. This Foreman was a fellow dwelt in Lambeth, a very silly fellow, yet had wit enough to cheat ladies and other women by pretending a skill in telling their fortunes, as whether they should bury their husbands, and what second husbands they should have, and whether they should enjoy their loves, or whether maids should get husbands, or enjoy their servants to themselves without co-rivals. But before he would tell anything, they must write their names to his alphabetical book with their own handwriting. By this trick he kept them in awe, if they should complain of his abusing them, as in truth he did nothing else.
Besides, it was believed, some meetings were at his house, wherein the art of a bawd was more beneficial to him than that of a conjurer, and that he was a better artist in the one than other.
And that you may know his skill, he was himself a cuckold, having a very pretty wench to his wife, which would say she did it to try his skill, but it fared with him as with astrologers that cannot foresee their own destiny. I well remember there was much mirth made in the court upon the showing this book, for it was reported the first leaf my Lord Cook lighted on, he found his own wife's name. The next that came on the stage was Sir Thomas Monson. But the night before he was to come to his trial, the king being at the game of Moor, said, "To-morrow comes Tom Monson to his trial." "Yea," said the king's cardholder, "where if he do not play his master prize, your majesty shall never trust me." This so ran in the king's mind, as the next game he said he was sleepy and would play out that set next night. The gentleman departed to his lodging, but was no sooner gone but the king sent for him. What communication they had I know not, yet it may be can more easily guess than any other, but it is most certain, next under God, that gentleman saved his life, for the king sent a post presently to London to let the Lord Chief Justice know he would see Monson's examination and confession, to see if it were worthy to touch his life for so small a matter. Monson was too wise to set anything but fair in his confession. What he would have stabbed with should have been viva voce at his arraignment. The king sent word he saw nothing worthy of death or of bonds in his accusation or examination. Cook was so mad he could not have his will of Monson, that he said, "Take him away, we have other matters against him of an higher nature." With which words out issues about a dozen warders of the Tower, and took him from the bar. And Cook's malice was such against him, as, though it rained extremely and Monson not well, he made him go afoot from the Guildhall to the Tower, which almost cost him his life. There he lay a close prisoner above 3 months, to the end to get a recorder's place that Cranfield desired. Every man thinking him in some treason would not lend him any money, and if so much money had not been paid by such a time,
his place had been forfeited.
And in this let me commend the part of a true friend in Sir Humphrey May, who in 24 hours,
after Sir Thomas's deep sensibleness of all other his friends deserting him in that great exigency,
made his brother Herrick take up £2,000 and pay it, to save his office, without so much as any security from Sir Thomas Monson, for he was close prisoner, or from any friend of his. And that you may know it was for his office only, this hard measure which showed him, the money was no sooner paid, but his friends might come unto him. And I must not let pass the skill of the Lord Loriskin, a Scotchman, who long before by his physiognomy told Sir George Marshall that Sir Thomas Monson would escape hanging nearer than ever any man did, which was true, for he was twice brought to his trial, put himself both times upon his country, yet was only indicted, never tried, and yet he had harder measure than ever any man had, for he lost his office, being but indicted and not condemned, which is without any precedent. And now for the last act enters Somerset himself on the stage, who, being told, as the manner is, by the lieutenant that he must provide to go next day to his trial, did absolutely refuse it, and said they should carry him in his bed, that the king had assured him he should not come to any trial, neither durst the king bring him to trial. This was in an high strain, and in a language not well understood by Sir George Moore, then lieutenant in Elwes's room, that made Moore quiver and shake, and however he was accounted a wise man, yet he was near at his wit's end. Yet away goes Moore to Greenwich, as late as it was, being 12 at night, bounceth at the back stairs as if mad, to whom came Joe Leviston, one of the grooms, out of his bed, and inquires the reason of that distemper at so late a season. Moore tells him he must speak with the king. Leviston replies he is quiet,
which in the Scottish dialect is fast asleep.
Moore says you must awake him. Moore was called in, the chamber left to the king and Moore. He tells the king those passages, and desired to be directed by the king, for he was gone beyond his own reason to hear such bold and undutiful expressions from a faulty subject against a just sovereign. The king falls into a passion of tears. On my soul, Moore, I wot not what to do. Thou art a wise man. Help me in this great strait, and thou shalt find thou dost it for a thankful master, with other sad expressions.
Moore leaves the king in that passion, but assures him he will prove the utmost of his wit to serve his majesty, and was really rewarded with a suit worth to him £1,500, although Annandale, his great friend, did cheat him of 1/2, so was their falsehood in friendship. Sir George Moore returns to Somerset about 3 next morning of that day he was to come to trial, enters Somerset's chamber, tells him he had been with the king, found him a most affectionate master unto him, and full of grace in his intentions towards him.
But, said he, To satisfy justice you must appear, although return instantly again without any further proceedings. Only you shall know your enemies and their malice, though they shall have no power over you. With this trick of wit he allayed his fury, and got him quietly about 8 in the morning to the hall, yet feared his former bold language might revert again, and being brought by this trick into the toil, might have more enraged him to fly out into some strange discovery.
For prevention whereof he had 2 servants placed on each side of him with a cloak on their arms, giving them withal a peremptory order, if that Somerset did any way fly out on the king, they should instantly hoodwink him with that cloak, take him violently from the bar, and carry him away, for which he would secure them from any danger, and they should not want also a bountiful reward. But the Earl, finding himself overreached, recollected a better temper, and went on calmly in his trial, where he held the company until 7 at night. But who had seen the king's restless motion all that day, sending to every boat he saw landing up the bridge, cursing all that came without tidings, would have easily judged all was not right, and there had been some grounds for his fears of Somerset's boldness.
But at last one bringing him word he was condemned, and the passages all was quiet. This is the very relation from More's own mouth, and this he told verbatim in Wanstead Park to 2 gentlemen, of whom the author was one, who were both left by him to their own freedom without engaging them, even in those times of high distemperatures, unto a faithful secrecy in concealing it. Yet though he failed in his wisdom, they failed not in that worth inherent in every noble spirit, never speaking of it till after the king's death. And there were other strong inducements to believe Somerset knew that by the king he desired none other in the world should be partaker of, and that all was not peace within the peacemaker himself. For he ever courted Somerset to his dying day, and gave him £4,000 per annum for fee-farm rents, after he was condemned, which he took in his servants' names, not his own, as then being condemned, not capable of. And he then resolved never to have a pardon. I have heard it credibly reported he was told by a wizard that could he but come to see the king's face again, he should be reinvested in his former dearness with him. This had been no hard experiment, but belike he had too much religion to trust to wizards, or else some friends of his had trusted them and been deceived by them, that he had little reason to put confidence in them. Many believed him guilty of Overbury's death,
but the most thought him guilty only of the breach of friendship, and that in a high point, by suffering his imprisonment,
which was the high way to his murder, and this conjecture I take to be of the soundest opinion.
For by keeping him out of the action, if it were discovered, his greatness, fortified with innocency, would carry their nocences through all dangers.
For the gentleman himself, he had misfortune enough to marry such a woman in such a family, which first undermined his honour, afterwards his life, at least to be dead in law.
Nor did anything reflect upon him in all his time of favourite,
but in and by that family. First in his adulterous marriage, then in so hated a family, and the bringing in Cranfield and Ingram as projectors, all by his wives' and friends' means. Otherwise had he been the bravest favourite of our time, full of majesty, employing his time like a statesman, and the king kept correspondency with him by letters almost weekly to his dying day. And here have we brought this great man's glory to its period, with his fatal countess, who some years after it died miserably at Chiswick. Mistress Turner, Weston, Franklin, and Elwes died in the Tower, Weston ever saying it never troubled him to die for the blue ribbon's sake. And so was concluded that grand business, the gross production of a then foul state and court, wherein pride, revenge, and luxury abounded.
Yet, and it's verily believed,
when the king made those terrible imprecations on himself and deprecations of the judges, it was intended the law should run in its proper channel, but was stopped and put out of course by the folly of that great clerk, though no wise man, Sir Edward Coke, who in a vainglorious speech, to show his vigilancy,
enters into a rapture as he then sat on the bench, saying,
God knows what became of that sweet babe Prince Henry, but I know somewhat. And surely in searching the cabinets he lighted on some papers that spake plain in that which was ever whispered, which had he gone on in a gentle way would have fallen in of themselves, not to have been prevented. But this folly of his tongue stopped the breath of that discovery, of that so foul a murder which I fear cries still for vengeance.
And now begins the new favourite to reign, without any concurrent. Now he rises in honour, as well as swells with pride, breaking out of those modest bounds which formerly had impaled him to the high way of pride and scorn, turning out and putting in all he pleased.
First he must aspire to the Admiral's office himself, and would not let the old gentleman, so well deserving in that place, die with that title. But the king must put himself to a great charge to put out the better and take in the worse.
Yet for all his immense greatness would he never let him be admiral,
until he had first settled Sir Robert Mansell Vice-Admiral of England during his life by patent, in which he not only manifested his love to his noble friend, though sometime his servant, but his care to the state, that his experience and abilities might support the other's inabilities, well knowing that the honour and safety of the kingdom consisted in the well-ordering and strength of the navy. Next, Egerton had displeased him by not giving way to his exorbitant desires. He must out, and would not let him seal up his dying eyes with the seals which he had so long carried and so well discharged. And to despite him the more, and to vex his very soul in the last agony, he sent Bacon, one he hated yet to be his successor, for the seals which the old man's spirit could not brook, but sent them by his own servant to the king, and shortly after yielded his soul to his Maker. And to the end you may know what men were made choice of to serve turns, I shall set you down a true story. This great favourite sent a noble gentleman and of much worth to Bacon with this message, that he knew him to be a man of excellent parts, and as the times were, fit to serve his master in the keeper's place. But he also knew him of a base and ingrateful disposition, and an arrant knave, apt in his prosperity to ruin any that had raised him from adversity. And yet for all this he did so much study his master's service, knowing how fit an instrument he might be for him, that he had obtained the seals for him. But with this assurance, should he ever requite him as he had done some others to whom he had been more bound, he would cast him down as much below scorn as he had now raised him high above any honour he could ever have expected. Bacon was at that time Attorney General, who, patiently hearing this message, replied, I am glad my noble lord deals so friendly and freely with me, and hath made that choice of so discreet and noble a friend, that hath delivered his message in so plain language. But, saith he, can my lord know these abilities in me? And can he think, when I have attained the highest preferment my profession is capable of, I shall so much fail in my judgment and understanding as to lose these abilities? And by my miscarriage to so noble a patron cast myself headlong from the top of that honour to the very bottom of contempt and scorn? Surely my lord cannot think so meanly of me. The gentleman replied, I deliver you nothing from myself, but the words are put into my mouth by his lordship, to which I neither add nor diminish. For had it been left to my discretion, surely, though I might have given you the substance, yet should I have apparelled it in a more modest attire. But as I have faithfully delivered my lord's to you, so will I as faithfully return yours to his lordship. You must understand the reason of this message was his ungratefulness to Essex, which every one could remember, for the Earl saved him from starving, and he requited him so, as his apology must witness. Were there not a great fault, there needed no apology. Nor could any age but a worthless and corrupt in men and manners have thought him worthy such a place of honour. Well, Lord Keeper he was, for which he paid nothing, nor was he able. For now was there a new trick to put in dishonest and necessitous men, to serve such turns as men of plentiful fortunes and fair reputations would not accept of. And this filled the church and commonwealth full of beggarly fellows, such daring to venture on anything, having nothing to lose. For it is riches makes men cowards, poverty daring and valiant to adventure at anything to get something. Yet did not Buckingham do things gratis, but what their purses could not stretch unto, they paid in pensions out of their places, all of which went to maintain his numerous beggarly kindred. Bacon paid a pension Heath, attorney, paid a pension. Bargrave, dean, paid a pension, with many others. Nor was this any certain rule, for present portions must be raised for the marriage of a poor kitchen maid to be made a great countess. So Fotherby, made Bishop of Sarum, paid £3,500, and some also worthy men were preferred gratis to blow up their fames and trumpet forth their nobleness. As Tolson, a worthy man, paid nothing in fine or pension. After him Davenant in the same bishopric, but these were but as music before every scene. Nor were fines or pensions certain, but where men were rich, there fines without reservation of rent; where poor, and such as would serve turns,
there pensions, no fines. So Weston and many others.
There were books of rates on all the offices, bishoprics, deaneries in England, that could tell you what fines, what pensions. Otherwise it had been impossible such a numerous kindred could have been maintained with the 3 kingdoms' revenue. Now was Bacon invested in his office, and within 10 days after the king goes to Scotland. Bacon instantly begins to believe himself king, lies in the king's lodgings, gives audience in the great banqueting house, makes all other councillors attend his motions, with the same state the king used to come out, to give audience to ambassadors. When any other councillor sat with him about the king's affairs, would, if they sat near him, bid them know their distance. Upon which Secretary Winwood rose, went away, and would never sit more under his encroached state, but instantly dispatched one to the king to desire him to make haste back.
For even his very seat was already usurped, at which I remember the king reading it unto us, both the king and we were very merry. And if Buckingham had sent him any letters, would not vouchsafe the opening or reading them in public, though it was said requiring speedy dispatch, nor would vouchsafe him any answer. In this posture he lived until he heard the king was returning, and began to believe the play was almost at an end, he might personate a king's part no longer, and therefore did again reinvest himself with his old rags of baseness, which were so tattered and poor. At the king's coming to Windsor, he attended 2 days at Buckingham's chamber, being not admitted to any better place than the room where trencher scrapers and lackeys attended, there sitting upon an old wooden chest, amongst such as for his baseness were only fit companions, although the honour of his place did merit far more respect, with his purse and seal lying by him on that chest. Myself told a servant of my Lord of Buckingham's it was a shame to see the purse and seal of so little value or esteem in his chamber, though the carrier without it merited nothing but scorn, being worst among the basest. He told me they had command it must be so. After 2 days he had admittance. At first entrance he fell down flat on his face at the Duke's foot, kissing it, vowing never to rise till he had his pardon. Then was he again reconciled, and since that time so very a slave to the Duke and all that family, that he durst not deny the command of the meanest of the kindred, nor oppose anything. By this you see, a base spirit is ever most concomitant with the proudest mind, and surely never so many brave parts and so base and abject a spirit tenanted together in any one earthen cottage as in this one man. I shall not remember his baseness, being out of his place, of pinning himself for very scraps on that noble gentleman Sir Julius Caesar's hospitality, that at last he was forced to get the king's warrant to remove him out of his house. Yet in his prosperity, the one being Chancellor and the other Master of the Rolls, did so scorn and abuse him, as he would alter anything the other did. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added the Court of King Charles, by Anthony Weldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Court of King James, Part 6. And now Buckingham, having the Chancellor, Treasurer, and all great officers, his very slaves, swells in the height of pride, summons up all his country kindred, the old Countess providing a place for them to learn to carry themselves in a court-like garb. But because they could not learn the French dances so soon as to be suitable to their gay clothes, country dances, for their sakes only, must be the garb of the court,
and none else must be used.
Then must these women kindred be married to earls.
Earls' eldest sons, barons, or chief gentlemen of greatest estates, insomuch that the very female kindred were so numerous as were sufficient to have peopled any plantation. Nay, very kitchen wenches were married to knights' eldest sons. Yet, as if England had not matches enough in the kingdom, they married like the House of Austria in their own kindred. Witness the Earl of Anglesey married a cousin german, to whom he had given earnest before. So that King James, that naturally in former times hated women, had his lodgings replenished with them, and all of the kindred, the brethren great earls. Little children did run up and down the king's lodgings, like little rabbit starters about their burrows. Here was a strange change, that the king, who formerly would not endure his queen children in his lodgings, now you would have judged that none but women frequented them. Now that was not all, but the kindred had all the houses about Whitehall, as if they had been bulwarks and flankers to that citadel. But above all the miracles of those times, old Sir Anthony Ashley, who never loved any but boys, yet he was snatched up for a kinswoman, as if there had been a concurrency through the kingdom, that those that naturally hated women yet should love his kindred, as well as the king him. And the very old midwives of that kindred flocked up for preferment, of which old Sir Christopher Perkins, a woman-hater that never meant to marry, nay, it was said he had made a vow of virginity, yet was coupled to an old midwife. So that you see the greatness of this favourite, who could force by his power over the king, though against nature. But I must tell you, this got him much hatred, to raise brothers and brother-in-laws to the highest rank of nobility, which were not capable of the place, of scarce a justice of the peace. Only his brother Purbeck had more wit and honesty than all the kindred beside, and did keep him in some bounds of honesty and modesty, whilst he lived about him, and would speak plain English to him, for which plainness, when they had no colour to put him from his brother, they practised to make him mad, and thought to bring that wicked stratagem to effect by countenancing a wicked woman, his wife, the Lord Cook's daughter, against him, even in her base and lewd living. And now is Purbeck mad indeed, and put from court. Now none great with Buckingham but bawds and parasites, and such as humoured him in his unchaste pleasures. So that since his first being a pretty, harmless, affable gentleman, he grew insolent, cruel, and a monster not to be endured. And now is Williams, sometimes chaplain to the Lord Keeper Egerton, brought into play, made a privy councillor. Dean of Westminster, and of secret counsel with the king, he was also made Bishop of Lincoln, and was generally voiced at his first step to marry Buckingham's mother, who was in her husband's time created a countess, he remaining still a silly drunken sot. And this was the first precedent of this kind ever known. Williams held her long in hand, and no doubt in nature of her confessor was her secret friend, yet would not marry at present, which afterwards was cause of his downfall. Then was there a Parliament summoned, in which Bacon for his bribery and injustice was thrust out, being closely prosecuted by one Morby, a woodmonger, and one Renham, formerly deeply censured in the Star Chamber for accusing him of bribery and injustice. Bacon was by Parliament justly put out of his place, and but only for the votes of the bishops had been degraded. The bishops might have done better to have kept their voices, to have done themselves service at this time, but surely that with some other injustice of theirs had so filled up their measure of iniquity that now God's anger is kindled against them. In Bacon's place comes Williams, a man on purpose brought in at first to serve turns, but in this place to do that which none of the laity could be found bad enough to undertake. Whereupon this observation was made, that first, no layman could be found so dishonest as a clergyman; next, as Bacon, the father of this Bacon, did receive the seals from a bishop, so a bishop again received them from a Bacon. And at this did the lawyers fret, to have such a flower pulled out of their garland. This Williams, though he wanted much of his predecessor's abilities for the law, yet did he equal him for learning and pride, and beyond him in the way of bribery. This man answering by petitions, in which his servants had one part, himself another, and so was calculated to be worth to him and his servants £3,000 per annum, by a new way never found out before. And now, being come to the height of his preferment, he did estrange himself from the company of the old Countess, having much younger Weir, who had keys to his chamber, to come to him. Yet was there a necessity of keeping him in this place for a time, the Spanish match being yet in chase, and if it succeeded, this man was to clap the Great Seal, through his ignorance in the laws, to such things that none that understood the danger by knowing the laws would venture upon. And for this design was he at first brought in, no prince living knowing how to make use of men better than King James. Now was also Suffolk turned out of his place of Lord Treasurer, and a fellow of the same batch that Williams was brought into his place, Cranfield, that was the projector, and never could get higher than that title in Somerset's time, now marrying one of Buckingham's kindred, attained one of the highest titles in the kingdom. So that it was now generally said that for pride and baseness these two great places were never so suited, both of mean birth, both proud, only the one an excellent scholar and of great parts, the other nothing but a pack of ignorance, soldered together with impudence to raise him, besides his marriage and the lusty kindred. This Cranfield was a fellow of so mean a condition as none but a poor spirited nobility would have endured his perching on that high tree of honour, to the dishonour of the nobility, the disgrace of the gentry, and not long after to his own dishonour, who was thrust out of the Lord's house, with this censure, that thou, Lionel, Earl of Middlesex, shalt never sit or have voice more in this House of Peers, and shalt pay for a fine to our sovereign lord the King £20,000, leaving him still to overtop the gentry. The bishops kept him also from degrading, which I do verily believe is one cause the gentry will degrade them.
The Spanish match having been long in treaty, and it being suspected now that the Spaniard did juggle with the state in this,
as they formerly did in a match with that brave Prince Henry, and in truth in all other things wherein any negotiation had been, only feeding the king with fair hopes and fair words, yet foul deeds. Whether the king suspected any such matter, or any whimsy came in the brain of this great favourite and prince, to imitate the old stories of the knights errant, but agreed it was, it should seem, between the favourite and the prince only, no one other so much as dreaming of any such adventure except Cottington, that the prince must go himself into Spain. Away they went under the borrowed names of Jack and Tom Smith, to the amazement of all wise men, only accompanied with Cottington, and some one or two more at most. Taking their way by France, they had the ports laid so that none should follow them, or give any notice to the French court, till they might get the start, etc. Yet their wisdoms made them adventure to stay in the French court, and look on that lady whom he after married. And there did this Mars imitate one of Prince Arthur's knights, in seeking adventures through foreign princes' territories. First beheld this French beauty, Mars vidit, visamque cupit, potiturque cupita, as in our discourse will afterward appear. From thence away to Spain, but as the journey was only plotted by young heads, so it was so childishly carried that they escaped the French king's couriers very narrowly. But escape they did, and arrived safely in Spain, their wished port, before either welcome or expected by our ambassadors or that state. Yet now must the best face be put on at all hands that put their grandees to new shifts, and our ambassador the Earl of Bristol to try his wit, for at that time was Sir Walter Aston also ambassador at Spain. In all occurrences Aston complied with the Prince and Duke, Bristol ran counter, and the Duke and Bristol hated each other mortally. Bristol had the advantage of them there, as having the much better headpiece, and being more conversant and dear with that state, wholly complying with them, and surely had done them very acceptable services, and in this very treaty was of the pack. Buckingham had the advantage of him in England, although the king did now hate Buckingham, yet was so awed that he durst not discover it. Then Buckingham had all interest in his successor by this journey, so that he laid a present and future foundation of his succeeding greatness. For all his power and greatness, Bristol did not forbear to put all scorns, affronts, and tricks on him, and Buckingham lay so open as gave the other advantage enough by his lascivious carriage and miscarriage. Amongst all his tricks he plays one so cunningly that it cost him all the hair on his head and put him to the diet. For it should seem he made court to Conde Olivares' wife, a very handsome lady. But it was so plotted betwixt the lady, her husband, and Bristol, that instead of that beauty he had a notorious stewsbird sent him, and surely, by reason of his said loose and vicious disposition, had ever the match been really intended for our prince, yet such a companion or guardian was enough to have made that wary nation believe that he had also been that way addicted, and so have frustrated the marriage, that being a grave and sober people, now especially when conversed with by such great foreign guests. But they well observed the prince himself to be of an extraordinary well-stayed temper. But now many lords flocked over, and many servants,
that he might appear the Prince of England, and like himself, though he came thither like a
private person. Many treaties were, sometimes hope, sometimes despair, sometimes great assurance, then all dashed again. And however his entertainment was as great as possible that state could afford, yet was his addresses to and with the lady such as rendered him mean and a private person, rather than a prince of that state that formerly had made Spain feel the weight of their anger and power, and was like a servant, not a suitor, for he never was admitted but to stand barehead in her presence, nor to talk with her but in a full audience with much company. At last, after many heats and cools, many hopes and despairs, the prince wrote a letter to his father of a desperate despair, not only of not enjoying his lady, but of never more returning, with this passage: "You must now, sir, look upon my sister and her children, forgetting ever you had such a son, and never thinking more of me." Now the folly of this voyage, plotted only by green heads, began to appear, many showing much sorrow, many smiling at their solace, and in truth glad in their hearts. And however the king was a cunning dissembler, and showed much outward sorrow, as he did for Prince Henry's death, yet something was discerned which made his court believe little grief came near his heart.
For that hatred he bare to Buckingham long, as being satiated with him, and his adoring the rising sun, not looking after the sun's setting,
made the world believe he would think it no ill bargain to lose his son, so Buckingham might be lost also. For had he not been weary of Buckingham, he would never have adventured him in such a journey. All his courtiers knew that very well. And for a further illustration of his weariness of Buckingham, it appeared in the Parliament before, when the king gave so much way to his ruin, that Buckingham challenged him that he did seek his ruin, and being generally held as a lost man. The king, to make it appear it was not so, although as hereafter you shall understand it was so, and that the king durst not avow his own act, brought him off from that Parliament, but Buckingham hated the king ever afterwards. The reason the king so hated Buckingham, besides his being weary of him for his now staleness, was his marriage, after which the king's edge was ever taken off from all favourites as well as him. Yet this had so much the overawing power of him that he durst not make show to affect any other. There was one Immortal, a Spanish ambassador extraordinary here, being an old soldier and a gallant fellow, who thought that Buckingham did not give that respect to him was due to his own person, or to the person of so great a king, whose person he represented. Immortal therefore did as much scorn and slight Buckingham, and the prince whom he found wholly governed by Buckingham. For now Buckingham had found by many passages the king's desire to be rid of him, he made court to the prince, and so wrought himself into his affection, that Damon and Pythias were not more dear to each other, which by no means could the old king away with.
Nor in truth did any other like or approve of the prince's poor spirit,
fearing it foretold his future inclination,
that could ever endure any familiarity with such an one as had put such foul scorns and affronts on him in his time of greatness with the father,
especially such as called to mind the bravery of his brother, who hated the whole family for their general baseness, although none of them had ever offended him in particular, as this man had done the prince at 2 several times. Once before an infinite concourse, by bidding him in plain terms kiss his arse; a second time, offering to strike him, saying in most undutiful terms, "By God, it shall not be so, nor you shall not have it," lifting up his hand over his head with a ballon bracer, that the prince said, "What, my lord, I think you intend to strike me." The first of these audacious affronts was at Royston, the second at Greenwich, before about 400 people. neither of which were to be endured by a private person, but by a prince from a private person, surely it showed a much less spirit than should have been inherent to a prince. And after this to be so dear with him as to be governed by him all his lifetime, more than his father was in the prime of his affection, I can give it no title mean enough. It had been worthy the noble mind of a prince to have forgotten such injuries, as never to have revenged them when he had been king, but never to have suffered him to have come near his court, to upbraid him with the sight of so much scorn, and that publicly offered him before. But at that time I well remember some critics in court did not stick to read his future destiny. This Igniossa, being a brave daring gentleman, used some speeches in the derogation of the Prince and Buckingham, as if they were dangerous to the old king. Nay, Igniossa sent one Padre Macestria, a Spanish Jesuit and a great statesman, to King James to let him know that he, under confession, had found the king was by Buckingham or by his procurement to be killed, but whether by poison, pistol, dagger, etc., that he could not tell. The king, after the hearing of this, was extreme melancholy, and in that passion was found by Buckingham at his return to him. The king, as soon as ever he espied him, said, "Ah, Steny, Steny,"
for so he ever called him in familiarity,
"wilt thou kill me?" At which Buckingham started and said, "Who, sir, hath so abused you?" At which the king sat silent.
Out went Buckingham, fretting and fuming, asked who had been with the king in his absence.
It was told him, Padre Macestria. Then who brought him to the king? It was replied, the Earl of Kelly. Then flew Buckingham on him, to know how he durst bring any one in to the king in his absence or without his licence. Kelly stood up close to him, for you must know Kelly was the truest alarum to give warning of the downfall of a favourite of any in the court, and knew his power could do him no hurt with the king in present, although it utterly cast him out of all favour from the king in future. Then Buckingham questioned Padre Macestria, but that quarrel was interposed and undertook by Igniossa, who told him he would maintain him a traitor,
and that, were his master's person off him, he was a chevalier and better born than himself, and would make it good on him with his sword. Which high comparison, though I believe true enough, together with his generous charge and challenge, Buckingham for that time swallowed, and only thought of this shift to vindicate himself on Igniossa, which was to cause the prince to write a letter of complaint to the King of Spain for abusing him and Buckingham. But the King of Spain returned the letter in a kind of scorn to Igniossa, not as blaming him, but rather commending him. And Igniossa, in scorn, sent it to the prince, as if he should say, "There is your letter to wipe, which is all it is fit for." Now have you heard what made the king hate Buckingham, you shall also hear the reason of Buckingham's extreme hatred to the king, which was believed the cause of his so speedy death. Yelverton, a very faithful servant to the king and his Attorney General, and no less affectionate to Somerset, being formerly raised by him, without any seeking of his or so much as within his thought, in so much as to express his love to Somerset, he desired to lay down that great place, rather than aggravate, as his place required, against him. This man, as well out of his faithfulness to the king as affection to Somerset, was made choice of to work the downfall of Buckingham, in which he apparently showed himself. But Buckingham, as I told you before, out of the king's fear that durst not maintain his own design, but left his instruments to the mercy of Buckingham's tyranny, being once gotten out of the toil, like a chased boar, foamed and bit at all came near him, and amongst them first fastened on Yelverton, put him out of his place, and committed him close prisoner to the Tower.
Yelverton, having showed himself so faithful to his master, and he again so unfaithful to him, to leave him to undergo the whole burden of Buckingham's fury, did fly out in some passion before Sir Alan Appersley, then lieutenant of the Tower, and Buckingham's great creature. Appersley telling the Duke of some passages in his passion, the Duke one night about 12 o'clock came in a disguise, and with the lieutenant only entered Yelverton's lodging. Yelverton at first sight started, verily believing he came in that manner to murder him. yet at last recollected himself, and said, "My lord, have you the king's warrant for this?" The Duke said, "No." Then said Yelverton, "How dare you enter a close prisoner's lodging? It is as much as your life is worth. And assure yourself, Master Lieutenant, the king shall know of this, and you must answer it." My lord said, "I come to you as a friend, though formerly I confess upon just cause your mortal enemy, only to ask you but 2 questions, which if you will resolve me, I vow to be a greater friend now than ever an enemy, and can and will restore you 4-fold." Yelverton told him, if they were such as he might, he would. The first he asked was, what wrong he had ever done him, that he so greedily thirsted after his blood. Yelverton replied, "Never any, but I was set on by a power that I could not withstand to do what I did." He asked him by whom. "By the king your master," said he, "who hates you more than any man living, which you might well understand, when in his speech to the Parliament he said, he would not spare any, no, not any that were dearest to him or lay in his bosom, by which he pointed them to you." "Well," said Buckingham, "I see you have dealt like a friend with me, by many other concurrences as well as by this. Give me your hand, henceforth you are my friend, and I am yours, and I will raise you higher than I have cast you down."
Which he had made good, had Yelverton lived to have enjoyed it.
For he was instantly released, and the next preferment he gratified him with was a judge's place, and he had been Lord Keeper had not death prevented it. And if there were no other reason but his change from a mortal enemy to so firm a friend, this were sufficient to confirm the truth of this story. But the author had this from Yelverton's own relation, and cannot commend Yelverton, because it is verily believed this hastened the king's death. Now have you heard the true causes of Buckingham's hatred to the king, and the king's to Buckingham. The king, having the more power to revenge, had the less courage. Buckingham less power, but more courage, sharpened with revenge. And however the world did believe the king's inclination was out of a religious ground, that he might not revenge, yet it was no other but a cowardly disposition that does not adventure. But although the king lost his opportunity on Buckingham, yet the black plaster and powder did show Buckingham lost not his on the king, and that it was no fiction but a reality that Padro Macestria had formerly told the king.
End of section 7. Section 8 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added The Court of King Charles, by Anthony Weldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Court of King James, Part 7.
And now to return from this digression, which is not impertinent, besides a great secret, the prince returns from Spain, contrary to expectation, in which the wisdom and gravity of the Spaniard failed him, especially if they did believe Padro Macestria. Besides, nature could not long support the old king, and then the Spaniard might have made no little advantage by enjoying such a pledge. But they have confessed their error, yet do palliate it with having the prince's faith in his proxy left with Digby, and got thence with the very same trick Sir Francis Mitchell said he got out of the Inquisition at Rome. Now is all the fault laid on Digby's false play and unfaithfulness to his master, and combining with the Spaniard, and by this piece of service expressing his hatred to the Spaniard for his own ends, the subjects of England having ever naturally hated them, Buckingham, the most hated man then living, from an accused man in the former Parliament, came to be the very darling of this Parliament, and a favourite to the whole kingdom, which after King James's death he has soon lost again, so inconstant are the multitude. In the banqueting house before both Houses of Parliament is Buckingham to give an account of this voyage, which he did at large, and to every full point, as a further attestation, he saith, "How say you, sir?" To which the prince answered, "Aye, yea, or yes," and through all this discourse laboured to make Bristol as hateful to this Parliament as himself had been to the former. Which, had these things delivered by him and attested by the prince been truths, he had justly deserved death. The accusations were foul and little less than treason, without any legislative power. Digby had some friends who instantly sent this declaration into Spain, Digby acquaints that king, takes his leave of him for England. That king sets his danger before him, offers if he will stay with him, seeing it is for his sake he is like to suffer, he would make him much greater in honour and fortune than his master can do. Digby gives him thanks, but says, he served so just a master that would not condemn him unheard, and should he, yet he had much rather suffer under innocency, than lie under the imputation of a false accusation of a fugitive and traitor, for the highest preferment in the world. Away therefore comes he, puts himself into a desperate passage, lest the Parliament should have been dissolved before his coming, and so no place or means left him for his defence, but must lie under those false calumnies, and was here, as the Prince came into Spain, sooner than either looked for or welcomed. Into the Parliament comes he with his hat full of papers, where he puts himself upon this point, that if there were one syllable true that Buckingham had delivered, if this, holding up a paper in his hand, be a true copy, I will yield myself guilty of all treasons can be laid to my charge, and said, these papers, pointing to his hat, shall make it manifest. Besides, some of them shall make Buckingham appear a very monster in his lascivious carriages, too unchaste for the ears of this honourable assembly. Bristol was instantly committed close prisoner to the Tower for a contempt. The next day he was riding through Cheapside in his coach, by which it appears Buckingham's power was in the wane with his old master, his relation and accusation being scandalous and false, nor ever durst he bring Bristol to any further trial. Whether this wound was deeper given by Bristol to Buckingham or the Prince, I will leave to the reader to judge, and will not myself determine. And how Bristol hath since stood in favour with the Prince since he was king, may give a conjecture that he took it as a wound to himself. I am sure it was an ill omen, and hath since given him less credit with his subjects. And in this Parliament doth Buckingham by his underhand ministers and agents accuse Cranfield, the Lord Treasurer, in which the Prince also shows himself. Cranfield was so hated a fellow for his insolency, that a small accusation would serve the turn, as this truly was, had his care of expending the king's treasure been out of a true zeal. For it should seem that the Prince, sending for moneys, Cranfield restrained his express, using some words that the journey itself was foolishly undertaken, and now must be maintained by prodigality, in which the revenue of the kingdom would not satisfy their vast expenses. If this had been spoken out of a noble mind, or out of that feeling he had of the kingdom's misery, as being treasurer he ought to have done, had he fallen, it had been with honour and a general compassion. But being spoken out of the pride and insolency of his own heart, his mind was ever so base, as never to discern what honour was, nor ever had he any other inherent honour than what in his apprenticeship he raked out of the kennel. Besides, it was known to be out of hatred that he was not of counsel in the undertaking, he then looking at himself as the only statesman of all the council. He fell without pity, and with much scorn, as I formerly set down, yet left in a higher estate and better condition than so worthless a fellow and base projector deserved. Yet afterwards he was again questioned upon his accounts. But all this was nothing, himself and his posterity being left peers of the realm. In this case was the Prince a principal actor, and did duly keep the earliest hours to sit in that Parliament, where then he discerned so much juggling even to serve his own ends on Cranfield, that it was not much to be wondered at, being come to be king, he did not affect them. And it was not well that a prince should show so much spleen, though Cranfield deserved any ill could be cast on him.
And who knows whether God doth now punish by Italian law, to call his own sin to remembrance and to repent.
In this place I hold it not unfit to show the reader how the king hath ever been abused, and would be abused, by overmuch credulity in the Treaty of Spain for marriages, as well as in all other negotiations. You shall now perceive how the king was abused in this treaty, which was an error inexcusable in himself and whole council. The Italians having a proverb, he that deceives me once, it's his fault, but if twice, it's my fault. This second time, therefore, could not but be the only fault of the king and council. In Prince Henry's lifetime, the king had a little man, but a very great and wise counsellor, his Secretary of State, little Salisbury, that great statesman, who did inherit all his father's wisdom as well as his offices.
And the son came little short of the father, who was held the greatest statesman in the world of his time. It is true that one state may abuse another, but not to find out the abuse is an unpardonable fault in any statesman. There was a treaty in the like case for Prince Henry. Salisbury instantly discovered the juggling before any other did think of any, for although it went forward currently, yet did Salisbury so put the Duke of Lerma unto it that either it must be so, or they must confess their juggling. The Duke of Lerma denied that ever there had been any treaty, or any intention from that state. Salisbury sent for the ambassador to a full council, told him how he had abused the king and state about a treaty for marriage, which he had no commission for, that therefore he was liable to the laws of our kingdom. For where any ambassador doth abuse a state by their master's commission, then the servant was freed, but without commission was culpable, and liable to be punished by the laws of that state, as being disavowed to be servant to the king his master. The ambassador answered gravely, he did not understand the cause of his coming, therefore was then unprepared to give any answer. But on Monday he would again come, this being Saturday, and give his answer.
On Monday he comes, begins with these words: My soul is my God's, my life my master's, my reputation my own. I will not forfeit the first and last to preserve the second. Then lays down his commission and letters of instruction under the Duke of Lerma's own hand. He acquitted himself honestly to this state, yet lost his own, being instantly sent for home, where he lived and died in disgrace. Here was legatus vir bonus peric remissus, sed non et mentiendum re publica causa. And had we had as honest and good statesmen in after times as Salisbury was, and so demonstrated himself in this weighty affair, this state could not have been so abused in all treaties. By this you see the advantage and benefit of one wise counsellor in a whole state. And although Solomon say, by the multitude of counsellors doth the kingdom flourish, yet surely he intended they should be wise men that are counsellors. For we had such a multitude of counsellors that a longer table and a larger council chamber was provided. Yet our state was so far from flourishing that it had been almost utterly destroyed. This was the last statesman worthy of that name, and now are the ancient stock of statesmen decayed, and with them all our honour and glory. I shall now bring my story to an end, as I shall this king's life. Although I have made some digressions, yet all pertinent to the discourse of this king's reign. He now goes to his last hunting journey. I mean the last of the year as well as of his life, which he ever ended in Lent, and was seized on by an ordinary and moderate tertian ague, which at that season, according to the proverb, was physic for a king. But it proved not so to him, and poor king, what was but physic to any other was made mortal to him. Yet not the ague, as himself confessed to a servant of his now living, who cried, Courage, sir, this is but a small fit, the next will be none at all, at which he most earnestly looked and said, Ah, it is not the ague afflicteth me, but the black plaster and powder given me and laid to my stomach. And in truth the plaster so tormented him that he was glad to have it pulled off, and with it the skin also. Nor was it fair dealing, if he had fair play, which himself suspected, often saying to Montgomery, whom he trusted above all men, in his sickness, For God's sake, look I have fair play, to bring in an emprick to apply any medicines, whilst those physicians appointed to attend him were at dinner. Nor could any but Buckingham answer it with less than his life at that present, as he had the next Parliament, had it not been dissolved upon the very questioning him for the king's death, and all those that prosecuted him utterly disgraced and banished the court. Buckingham coming into the king's chamber, even when he was at the point of death, and an honest servant of the king's crying, Ah, my lord, you have undone us, all his poor servants, although you are so well provided you need not care. At which Buckingham kicked at him, who caught his foot and made his head first come to ground, where Buckingham, presently rising, run to the dying king's bedside and cried, Justice, sir, I am abused by your servant and wrongfully accused. At which the poor king, become by that time speechless, mournfully fixed his eyes on him, as who would have said, Not wrongfully. It were worth the knowledge what his confession was, or what other expressions he made of himself, or any other. But that was only known to the dead Archbishop Abbot, and the Bishop Williams, then also Lord Keeper. And it was thought Williams had blabbed something which incensed the king's anger and Buckingham's hatred so much against him, that the loss of his place could not be expiatory sufficient, but his utter ruin must be determined, and that not upon any known crime, but upon circumstances and examinations, to pick out faults committed in his whole lifetime. But his greatest crime for the present, no question, was lapsus linguae. But quod defetur non aufertur, for although he escaped by the calm of that Parliament, yet is he more ruined by this Parliament and his own folly. And truly we may observe the just judgment of God on him, for flying from the Parliament his protector, to give wicked counsel to the king his former prosecutor. And now have I brought this great king's reign to an end, in a volant discourse, and shall give you his character in brief, and so leave him in peace after his life, who was styled the King of Peace in his life.
End of section 8. Section 9 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added The Court of King Charles, by Anthony Weldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Character of King James. This king's character is much easier to take than his picture, for he could never be brought to sit for the taking of that, which is the reason of so few good pieces of him. But his character was obvious to every eye. He was of a middle stature, more corpulent through his clothes than in his body, yet fat enough, his clothes ever being made large and easy, the doublets quilted for stiletto-proof, his breeches in great pleats and full stuffed. He was naturally of a timorous disposition, which was the reason of his quilted doublets. His eyes large, ever rolling after any stranger came in his presence, insomuch as many for shame have left the room as being out of countenance. His beard was very thin, his tongue too large for his mouth, which ever made him speak full in the mouth, and made him drink very uncomely, as if eating his drink, which came out into the cup of each side of his mouth. His skin was as soft as taffeta sarsenet, which felt so because he never washed his hands, only rubbed his fingers' ends slightly with the wet end of a napkin. His legs were very weak, having had, as was thought, some foul play in his youth, or rather before he was born, that he was not able to stand at 7 years of age. That weakness made him ever leaning on other men's shoulders. His walk was ever circular, his fingers ever in that walk sidling about his codpiece. He was very temperate in his exercises and in his diet, and not intemperate in his drinking. However, in his old age, and Buckingham's jovial suppers, when he had any turn to do with him, made him sometimes overtaken, which he would the very next day remember and repent with tears. It is true he drank very often, which was rather out of a custom than any delight, and his drinks were of that kind for strength, as Frontignac, Canary, high country wine, tent wine, and Scottish ale, that had he not had a very strong brain, might have daily been overtaken, although he seldom drank at any one time above 4 spoonfuls, many times not above 1 or 2. He was very constant in all things, his favourites excepted, in which he loved change, yet never cast down any he once raised from the height of greatness, though from their wonted nearness and privacy, unless by their own default by opposing his change, as in Somerset's case. Yet had he not been in that foul poisoning business, and so cast down himself, I do verily believe not him neither. For all his other favourites he left great in honour, great in fortune, and did much love Montgomery, and trusted him more at the very last gasp than at the first minute of his favouriteship. In his diet, apparel, and journeys he was very constant. In his apparel so constant as by his good will he would never change his clothes until worn out to very rags. His fashion never. Insomuch as one bringing to him a hat of a Spanish block, he cast it from him, swearing he neither loved them nor their fashions. Another time, bringing him roses on his shoes, he asked, if they would make him a rough-footed dove. 1 yard of sixpenny ribbon served that turn. His diet and journeys was so constant that the best observing courtier of our time was wont to say, were he asleep 7 years and then awakened, he would tell where the king every day had been and every dish he had had at his table. He was not very uxorious, though he had a very brave queen that never crossed his designs, nor intermeddled with state affairs, but ever complied with him, even against the nature of any but of a mild spirit, in the change of favourites. For he was ever best when furthest from his queen, and that was thought to be the first grounds of his often removes, which afterwards proved habitual. He was unfortunate in the marriage of his daughter, and so was all Christendom besides. But sure the daughter was more unfortunate in a father than he in a daughter. He naturally loved not the sight of a soldier, nor of any valiant man, and it was an observation that Sir Robert Mansell was the only valiant man he ever loved, and him he loved so entirely, that for all Buckingham's greatness with the king, and his hatred of Sir Robert Mansell, yet could not that alienate the king's affections from him, insomuch as, when by the instigation of Cottington, then ambassador in Spain, by Buckingham's procurement, the Spanish ambassador came with a great complaint against Sir Robert Mansell, then at Algiers to suppress the pirates, that he did support them. Having never a friend there, though many that durst speak in his defence, the king himself defended him in these words: My Lord Ambassador, I cannot believe this, for I made my choice myself of him out of these reasons. I know him to be valiant, honest, and nobly descended as most in my kingdom, and will never believe a man thus qualified will do so base an act. He naturally loved honest men that were not overactive, yet never loved any man heartily until he had bound him under him by giving him some suit, which he thought bound the other's love to him again. But that argued a poor disposition in him to believe that anything but a noble mind seasoned with virtue could make any firm love or union. For mercenary minds are carried away with a greater prize, but noble minds alienated with nothing but public disgraces. He was very witty, and had as many ready witty jests as any man living, at which he would not smile himself, but deliver them in a grave and serious manner. He was very liberal of what he had not in his own grip, and would rather part with £100 he never had in his keeping, than 1 20-shillings piece within his own custody. He spent much, and had much use of his subjects' purses, which bred some clashings with them in Parliament, yet would always come off and end with a sweet and plausible close. And truly his bounty was not discommendable, for his raising favourites was the worst. Rewarding old servants and relieving his native countrymen was infinitely more to be commended in him than condemned. His sending ambassadors were no less chargeable than dishonourable and unprofitable to him and his whole kingdom, for he was ever abused in all negotiations. Yet he had rather spend £100,000 on embassies to keep or procure peace with dishonour than £10,000 on an army that would have forced peace with honour. He loved good laws, and had many made in his time, and in his last Parliament, for the good of his subjects and suppressing promoters and progging fellows, gave way to that nullum tempus, etc., to be consigned to 60 years, which was more beneficial to the subjects in respect of their quiets than all the Parliaments had given him during his whole reign. By his frequenting sermons he appeared religious, yet his Tuesday sermons, if you will believe his own countrymen that lived in those times when they were erected and well understood the cause of erecting them, were dedicated for a strange piece of devotion. He would make a great deal too bold with God in his passion, both in cursing and swearing, and one strain higher verging on blasphemy, but would in his better temper say, he hoped God would not impute them as sins and lay them to his charge, seeing they proceeded from passion. He had need of great assurance rather than hopes that would make daily so bold with God. He was very crafty and cunning in petty things, as the circumventing any great man, the change of a favourite, etc., insomuch as a very wise man was wont to say, he believed him the wisest fool in Christendom, meaning him wise in small things, but a fool in weighty affairs. He ever desired to prefer mean men in great places, that when he turned them out again they should have no friend to bandy with them. And besides, they were so hated by being raised from a mean estate to overtop all men, that every one held it a pretty recreation to have them often turned out. There were living in this king's time at one instant 2 treasurers, 3 secretaries, 2 lord keepers, 2 admirals, 3 lord chief justices, yet but 1 in play. Therefore this king had a pretty faculty in putting out and in. By this you may perceive in what his wisdom consisted. But in great and weighty affairs, even at his wit's end. He had a trick to cozen himself with bargains underhand by taking £1,000 or £10,000 as a bribe, when his council was treating with his customers to raise them to so much more yearly. This went into his privy purse, wherein he thought he had overreached the lords, but cozened himself, but would as easily break the bargain upon the next offer, saying he was mistaken and deceived, and therefore no reason he should keep the bargain. This was often the case with the farmers of the customs. He was infinitely inclined to peace, but more out of fear than conscience, and this was the greatest blemish this king had through all his reign, otherwise might have been ranked with the very best of our kings. Yet sometimes would he show pretty flashes of valour, which might easily be discerned to be forced, not natural, and being forced, could have wished rather it would have recoiled back into himself than carried to that king it had concerned, lest he might have been put to the trial to maintain his seeming valour. In a word, he was, take him altogether and not in pieces, such a king I wish this kingdom have never any worse, on the condition not any better. For he lived in peace, died in peace, and left all his kingdoms in a peaceable condition, with his own motto, Beati Pacifici. End of section 9. Section 10 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added the Court of King Charles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Court of King Charles, Part 1. Now having brought this peaceable king to rest in all peace, the 27th of March his son by the sound of the trumpet was proclaimed king by the name of Charles I. His father's reign began with a great plague, and we have seen what his reign was. His son's with a greater plague, and the greatest that ever was in these parts. We shall see what his reign will be, and the effects of this plague have also hung as a fatal comet over this kingdom in some parts, and over London in more particular, ever since. And we earnestly pray we may not fall into the hands of men, but rather ever with that divinely inspired royal prophet David, that we fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. This king was not crowned with that solemnity all other kings have formerly been, by riding through the city in all state, although the same triumphs were provided for him as sumptuous as for any other. This some have taken as an ill omen. It's further reported, which I will not believe, that he took not the usual oath all our kings were bound unto at their coronation, and it's to be read in Coelho's book. If so, sure it's a worse omen. One more observation is of this king, which I remember not to have happened in any other kingdom, I am confident never in this, that with him did also rise his father's favourite, and in much more glory and lustre than in his father's time, as if he were no less an inheritor of his son's favour than the son of the father's crown. And this, as it happened, was the worst omen of all. For whereas in the father's time there was some kind of moderation, by reason he was weary of the insolency of his favourite, in the son's time he reigned like an impetuous storm, bearing down all before him that stood in his way, and would not yield to him or comply with him. This showed no heroical or kingly spirit for the king ever to endure him that had put such scorns and insolent affronts on him in his father's time. This king, as his father did set in peace, did rise like a Mars, as if he would say, Arma verumque cano, and to that end, to make himself more formidable to Spain and France, he called a Parliament, wherein never subjects expressed more hearty affections to a sovereign, and in truth were more loving than wise, for, as if for an income to welcome him, they gave him 2 entire subsidies, and in so doing they break the very foundation and privileges of Parliament, which never was wont to give subsidies but as a thankful gratuity for enacting good laws. Therefore it is but God's justice to repay them with tallion laws, to have their privileges broken, seeing they first chalked out the way. The king, in requital of this great love of theirs, did instantly dissolve the Parliament, which hath bred such ill blood in the veins of the subjects to their sovereign, and in the sovereign to the subject, that it is like to produce an epidemical infection. But the occasion taken to dissolve it was worst of all. For Buckingham, by his insolent behaviour, had not only lost that love his hatred to Spain had procured him, but was now grown into such an hatred that they fell on him for the death of his old master, which had been of a long time before but whispered. But now the examinations bred such confessions that it looked with an ugly, deformed, poisonous countenance, and nothing but the dissolution of that Parliament could have saved his dissolution, and that with a brand of shame and infamy as well as of ingratitude. I remember I heard a noble gentleman, an old Parliament man of that committee for examinations, say at first he derided the very thought of it, but after the first day's examination it proved so foul as that he both hated and scorned the name and memory of Buckingham. And though man would not punish it, God would, which proved an unhappy prediction. This dissolving the Parliament was ill relished by the people, and that which to them did seem the cause worse, and to make the case yet fouler, and that it must needs be the evident cause. Buckingham's counsels were so stupid, and himself so insolent, that he did think it a glory to disgrace all those that followed that business in that Parliament, or that seemed inquisitive thereafter, and caused many old servants of the king's he formerly favoured very much to be banished from court, never to return more, nor did they ever, as Clare, Crofts, Sir Francis Stewart, etc., nay, Dr. Cragg, his physician, who from his very childhood had the general repute of a very honest man, for expressing himself like an honest man in the king's presence, was instantly dismissed, never could recover his place or favour more. Now also is Williams, Lord Keeper, turned out of his place, and Coventry, the king's attorney, put in, who, had Buckingham lived, had as soon followed in the same steps. Then goes Buckingham into France on a stately embassy for that lady the king had seen and set an affection on in his passage to Spain, which was obtained with small entreaty. Now doth Buckingham soar so high both in his master's favours and in the pride of his own heart, as he alters all great officers, makes war against Spain and France, the quarrel only his, voiced to be on strange grounds, the success accordingly. Navies, armies, and nothing but war appears, as if we intended in show to conquer all that opposed. Lord Wimbledon the general, from whom as little could be expected as he performed, carrying a powerful army to Calais, after an infinite expense and drinking much Spanish wines, and beating out the heads of what they could not drink, as if they intended to overthrow that year's trade of Spanish wine, returned as like a valiant commander as he ever was reputed. Whereas had he brought home those wasted wines, it may be they would have defrayed the charge of that expedition. After the return of that wise pageantism, Denbigh is sent into France to aid Rochelle, who managed it better than his great kinsman Buckingham, who would afterwards needs go to do great exploits, for he brought his ships and men safe again, the other left his men in powdering tubs, as if he meant to have them kept sweet against his next coming thither. In short, this unhappy voyage lost all the honour our glorious ancestors had ever gotten over that nation, there being so many brave gentlemen wilfully lost, as if that voyage had been on purpose plotted to disable our nation, by taking away so many gallant brave young spirits, so many of our colours lost as trophies of their victory and of our shame, hung up in Notre Dame church, that the brave Talbot and Salisbury, with many other our valiant ancestors, will rise up in judgment against him for that every way inglorious act. Nay, to how low an ebb of honour was this our poor despicable kingdom brought, that, even in Queen Elizabeth's time the glory of the world, a great nobleman being taken prisoner, was freely released with this farewell given with him, that they desired but 2 English mastiffs for his ransom. But the king, by that unnecessary and dishonourable war, was driven to that exigency for want of money, that he was forced to pawn his rich cupboard of plate to Amsterdam, and to send Cottington into Spain in a manner to beg a peace, which having obtained, it was thought so great a service of him that it raised him to all his honour and fortunes. Yet all the while Rochelle in sharp distress was left unrelieved, although otherwise intended, or but pretended rather. For the courting betwixt the Duke and the Governor of the Isle of Ré, in sending compliments and presents to each other, showed rather an intimate dearness than any hostility to be meant between them. And sure I am the success made it apparent that their purpose was no better than to carry so many goodly gentlemen to the slaughter-house and powdering tub, as even now I instanced. Yet was the king so content to be abused, as publicly at his dinner he delivered it for a miracle, that having such ill success there were so few men lost, for that as many came home as went forth, as appeared by the chequer roll, within 500. At which a gentleman, whose faithful valour prompted him to speak a truth in season, though theirs did not them to fight, standing at the back of the king's chair, said, Yea, sir, as you hear, that hear very little of truth. But if you please to inquire of such as can and dare inform you truly, you shall find many thousands fewer came home than went forth. For which relation this honest tell-truth was commanded presently from his court attendants, which doom he never could get reversed, wherein you may behold the power of Buckingham with the king, whose word stood for a law. Which power of his grew now so exorbitant he aspires to get higher titles, both in honour and place, as Prince of Tipperary, a place so called in Ireland, and Lord High Constable of England, an office aimed at by that monster and Machiavellian Leicester in Queen Elizabeth's time, but he therein was crossed and contradicted by the then Lord Chancellor Hatton, now affected by Buckingham, who herein wrote after Leicester's ambitious example, but he crossed too by precedent with Coventry, now Lord Keeper, and no question but upon those just grounds his predecessor did. For you must understand, this office hath an authority annexed unto it to call any subject in question for his life, by trying, condemning, and executing him in despite of the king himself. Nay, some have made no bones on to affirm that for misgovernment the king himself is not exempted from that officer's power. Politically, therefore, did the aforementioned Hatton, who well understood the validity of such a power, when Leicester's commission was in dispute, to tell the Queen that his own hand should never strike off his own head, which word was enough to her who was hereat so wise, as also in all other matters of state concernment, wherein, as she were hinted to a foresight of any prejudice, she knew how to prevent it. And thus that ended in his time. But Buckingham's ambition would not be so bounded, for upon the opposing it by Coventry, he peremptorily thus accosted him, saying, Who made you, Coventry, Lord Keeper? He replied, The king. Buckingham, sir, replied, It's false, 'twas I did make you, and you shall know that I, who made you, can and will unmake you. Coventry thus answered him, Did I conceive I held my place by your favour, I would presently unmake myself by rendering the seal to his majesty. Then Buckingham in a scorn and fury flung from him, saying, You shall not keep it long. And surely, had not Felton prevented him, he had made good his word. And before that happened, Weston was, by his power and for his ends, made treasurer. It should seem upon some assurance from him that he would find ways whereout to raise moneys into the treasury, he judging him to be one that out of his own necessitous condition would adventure on any desperate projection to raise himself, but yet withal to fill the chequer coffers, who was no sooner warmed in his office, but he began to show his inbred base disposition to his raiser, Buckingham, as formerly he had done to Cranfield, who was indeed his preserver from perishing in a prison, whence he redeemed him, making him a free partaker first of his bounteous table, then raising him shortly after to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, who at length, for requital, supplanted him. But for all this Buckingham feared not. His high spirit in himself and vast power with the king were so predominant and unmovable. He now therefore used at his own pleasure to come to the council table, he being then honoured as the oracle from whom they gaped for all answers, but ever made them wait his coming, and were so tutored to their duteous observance of him, that at his approach or returning thence they ever must rise as if he had been the king himself. So that you may see to what a pretty pass those great men by their poor spirits had brought themselves. But on a time there issued this amongst other passages of insolencies from Buckingham, who coming into the council without any other court preface, says to the Treasurer Weston, My lord, the king must have 60,000 provided against tomorrow morning. The lords startled at the mention of such a sum, the whole exchequer not having seen within its keeping scarce £1,000 in many years, and could not imagine how, unless by the philosopher's stone, such a sum was possible to be gotten. But yet all looking on Weston, to whom it was in this case proper to make answer, who bethought himself what to say, the rest every one the while gazing at each other, another while again all at Weston, as a man of great wisdom, for so was he accounted of a plebeian. At length up he stands, and thus he answers Buckingham, My lord, the exchequer is in deep consumption. Whereat Buckingham interrupts him, saying, How, sir? You came in to cure that consumption, and to restore it to its useful plenitude. I remember you promised, like a mountebank, when you were to be invested by the king, you would do so. Therefore, sir, see you the money be provided, otherwise you shall hear further of it. With that high strain he rose up and departed. Now are always endeavoured to get money from the subjects, which was not to be gotten by fair means, the king having tried all the shifts which any former prince out of the parliamentary way had ever done, and had great sums brought in, such as none of his predecessors ever had, of which one was the royal subsidy, every man lending as much as the sum in the subsidy towards which he was assessed. As if, for example, assessed at £40, besides so much paid, he lent also £40, and so from the least to the greatest proportions assessed. Yet all this would not serve him, but that quickly vanished. Then all other fair means proving, as was thought for their profuseness, too scant and slow, force then must be the last remedy. The king must keep standing garrisons to awe his good subjects, and they consisting too of strangers, not of natives. To that end one Dalbeer, that had been general of Count Mansfield horse, is dealt with for the raising of 1,000 or 2,000 German horse, the most whereof to be quartered betwixt Gravesend and London. For advancing of which service Sir William Balfour, as great a servant and confident he is now of this Parliament, was sent to Hamborough with £30,000 to buy and bring over those horse with their impressed riders and furniture. But many of them ready to be embarked, it should seem they were told by the way, by some well affected to England, that the king had not money to continue them in pay, and plunder they could not there, for they should be so environed with sea that there was no flying, but they must expect to have all their throats cut if they took anything from any man. Upon which those rascals, out of fear, not conscience, refused to come over. However, Balfour so well licked his fingers in that employment, as that he therewith laid the foundation of his future fortunes. Yet if this Parliament consider well this action of his, there is no reason he should be so dear unto them. For of anything yet touched upon against any man by this Parliament, I dare affirm this of his to be the greatest piece of villainy, and to be the nearest way to render us all slaves, and to make us have neither propriety in our estates, wives, nor children. And yet was this Balfour a principal undertaker and actor in this pernicious design, and perhaps for that very cause the greatest creature of Buckingham's that ever was. In this interval, their shifts not availing them, to see therefore if by this fair means their ends might be obtained, another Parliament was summoned, wherein, after some expostulations on both sides, there proved no better a good speed and success than a mere frustration of all hopes on both hands, which for the king's part he apprehended with so great averseness, that, as 'twas said, he made a vow never to call more Parliaments. End of section 10. Section 11 of the Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added the Court of King Charles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Court of King Charles, Part 2. Foreign forces, and fraudulent and fair devices homespun, failing all, now must projects in all their variegated inventions be set on foot, to which sage, or rather rueful purpose, one Noy, a very famous lawyer as ever this kingdom bred, and formerly a great patriot, and the only searcher of precedents for the parliaments, by which he grew so cunning as he understood all the shifts which former kings had used to get moneys with. This man the king sends for tells him he will make him his attorney. Noy, like a true cynic as he was, for that time went away, not returning to the king so much as the civility of a thanks. Nor indeed was it worth his thanks. I am sure he was not worthy of ours. For after the court solicitings had bewitched him to become the king's, he grew the most hateful man that ever lived. And it's to me a wonder that this Parliament of wonders doth not enact a law that his very name should never more be in this kingdom, he having been as great a deluge to this realm as the flood was to the whole world. For he swept away all our privileges, and in truth hath been the cause of all these miseries this kingdom hath since been engulfed. Whether you consider our religion, he being a great papist, if not an atheist, and the protector of all papists, and the raiser of them up unto that boldness they were now grown unto, who formerly had some moderation, or if you consider our estates and liberties, they were impoverished and enthralled by multitudes of projects and illegal ways. This monster was the sole author of all. But first, now because there must be some great man as a captain projector to lead some on and hearten others to follow, Sir George Goring leads up the march and dance with the monopoly of tobacco and licensing of taverns, setting some up where and as many as he pleased, and this done by a seal appendicular to an office erected by him for that purpose, as if authorized by a law. Besides all this, he hath pensions out of the pretermitted customs, insomuch as I have heard it most credibly reported that his revenue was £9,000 per annum, all of these kinds, and for this piece of good service he was made a lord and privy councillor, to countenance his train of projectors the better. Then did Weston enhance the customs, and laid new and heavier impositions on all things exported or imported, with such unconscionable rates upon tobacco that millions of pounds of it lay rotting in the custom-house, the merchants refusing to pay the custom, besides loss of all other charges for the tobacco itself. In short, there was not anything almost that any man did eat, drink, or wear, or had in his house from foreign parts, or scarce any domestic commodities exempted, but he paid, as it were, an excise for it. Yea, at last even cards and dice escaped not, but they were monopolized by a great counsellor, the Lord Cottington. Yea, to keep their hands in ewer, they got patents for the very rags, marrow-bones, guts, and such like excrements, as were thought of no use but to be cast on the dunghills. And he was held the bravest Commonwealth's man that could bring in the most money. Yet the king's private purse or public treasury little or nothing bettered but to impoverish and vex the subject, and to no other end, for which he was ordinarily rewarded with honour. This good service, the quite contrary way, did Weston and Noy do for the king, and I believe you shall see God reward them and their posterity. For the one, like a Jonas gourd, sprang up suddenly from a beggarly estate to much honour and great fortunes, will shortly wither. The other, his son and heir, was killed in France, presently after his death, and when both are dead, let their names and memory rot, and be extinct from the face of the earth. Now doth Buckingham provide for another foreign enterprise, but carried so close I could never learn what it was. Nor did any wise men much inquire after it, assuring themselves that such counsels could produce no better effects than those former. In the beginning, yea, even at the very entrance thereunto, he did so stink in the nostrils of God and man, that God made one Felton his instrument to take such a monster, as he was indeed, from his longer domineering amongst men, by a blow as fearful as strange, after which he had not time to say, Lord, have mercy on him. A just judgment on him that forsook God, to seek to the devil by witches and sorcerers in his life, one whereof was Dr. Lamb, who was his great defensive preserver, as he thought him, whose fate it was to be brained by a shoemaker's last when he least looked for it. The other was stabbed the next morning, after that night he had caused a fellow to be hanged, not suffering him to have that night's respite after his sentence, and offence, whate'er it was, to repent him of his sins, with this vow, he would neither eat nor drink until he see him die. God, in requital of his merciless cruelty, would neither suffer him to eat nor drink before he died, by that dismal stroke of a poor tenpenny knife of the said Felton's setting home. Thus near alike in time and manner were these two hellish agents' catastrophes. And now is set that great sun, or rather portentous comet, from whose influences all the officers and ministers had by reflection their life and heat. After his death, the very name of a favourite died with him, none singly engrossing the king's ear and favour. But a regular motion was set to all officers, as appertained to their several places, as to the Archbishop the management and chief superintendency of the Church, to the Lord Treasurer the Exchequer and the Customs, to the Lords Keepers of the Great and Privy Seals what belonged to equity, to the judges what belonged to law, so that one would have thought all things now went so just and equal, and in their proper channel, as none but might now expect from that new and better government halcyon days. But it fared far otherwise. God being angry at the nation's sins, the general juggling of the state was one, and a great one, all those procedures being but in appearance righteous, nothing really so, but like the apples of Sodom, fair in show, rotten and corrupt within. For now, instead of the late but one favourite, every great officer and lord of the council proved a very tyrant, and it appeared that not their virtues, but the former favourite's power only, did restrain them from being so. For that falling, together with himself, as you have heard, and they left to their own arbitrary power, you would verily have believed that hell had been broke loose. And to make good that metaphor, one of the council being told by a gentleman that the country was much troubled at a certain great grievance, replied, Doth that trouble them? By God, there are 7 worse devils to be shortly let out amongst them. And in sober sadness they all might truly have undergone the name of legion, for they were all many devils, and, like true devils, took pleasure in tormenting. So that hereby may be perceived the kingdom in general had no benefit, though some particular men, as Weston, Treasurer, Coventry, Lord Keeper, and all such as paid his beggarly kindred pensions, which now were ceased, by this man's death, whose purpose 'twas to have turned out of place both Coventry and Weston before his last intended voyage. But now did Weston begin to be more cruel in pride and tyranny than Buckingham had been before him, and had not the Archbishop Laud balanced him, he would have been more insufferable. He cheated the king in the sale of timber and of land, and in the letting of his customs, the Archbishop notwithstanding truly informing the king thereof. Weston was so mad at the thought of it, he would often say to his friends in private, that little priest would monopolize the king's ear, for he was ever whispering to the king. And now begin the council table, the Star Chamber, and High Commission to be scourges and tortures of the Commonwealth by imprisonments and mutilations of members, and were made, some of them, by signings, the greatest incomes to the Exchequer, and in truth did now put down the common laws deciding of meum and tuum. And if any desiring to appeal from them refused to stand there to their censures, they were committed until they would submit thereunto. If men sent unto by them for money refused it, they would imprison them, till they would give or lend, and if any was summoned thither they had a mind to quarrel with, in whom they could not find a fault, they would make one, by saying, "The gentleman laughs at us," or "The gentleman saith thus and thus." It may be that he had not in his thought, and yet there should not want a false witness. For some lords that sat with their backs towards them, or so far off that they could not hear, yet would testify either the words or actions. Or for want of this, a clerk of the council should be called to witness, who for his profit must swear what any lord said. If they hit not upon that trick, then sometimes they would contrive to put a gentleman into passion, by calling him some disgraceful name, or by scoffing at him, so that indeed the council table was grown more like a pasquill than a grave senate. But if the spirit of the man were such that he could not take those indignities without some regret, it was well for him if he escaped with imprisonment, and not called oretanus to the Star Chamber, and fined as many were to his undoing, for to that point were now the fines of that court risen. As for the High Commission Court, that was a very Spanish-like inquisition, in which all pollings and tyrannizings over our estates and consciences were practised, as were in the other over our estates and bodies. Then were the judges so much their servants, or rather slaves, that whate'er they illegally put in execution, they found law to maintain. But that which is a wonder above all wonders is that Coventry, who formerly had gained the opinion of a just and honest man, was a principal in all these miscarriages, yet died he unquestioned. When had his actions been scanned by a parliament, in that they were not, you may see what opinion is, which in the multitude blindeth the understanding, he had been found as foul a man as ever lived. Finch, a fellow of an excellent tongue, but not of 1 dram of law, made for all that Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, the only court most learned in the law, yet he brought all the learned judges except 2 only, Hutton and Crook, to be of his illegal opinion for ship money. This surely must be a punishment from God on them, and us for our sins, otherwise it had been impossible so many grave judges should have been overruled by such a slight and trivial fellow. Now also all officers in all places took what fees they pleased, as if in a jubilee. Amongst the rest, those of the Star Chamber, the Council Table, and the High Commission were very grandees. Yea, the very messengers to them were countenanced in their abuse and insultings over the gentry, when in their clutches. And to such a strange pass would his orders come unto, that every lackey of those great lords might give a checkmate to any gentleman, yea, to any country nobleman that was not in the court favour. And to fill full the measure of the time's abounding iniquity, the court chaplains, and others elsewhere, with the reverend bishops themselves, did preach away our liberties and proprieties, yet kept they divinity enough for their own interests. For they concluded all was either God's or the king's. Their part belonged to God, in which the king had no propriety. Our part belonged wholly to the king, in which we had propriety no longer when the king were disposed to call for them. So that betwixt the law and the gospel we were ejected out of lands, liberties, and lives at pleasure. And now is God's time come to visit with his justice, and behold it. For the pit they digged for others they themselves are fallen into, for all their honours, lands, and liberties are a gasping, and the judges are but in very little better case, for the Parliament will do that to them by the law which they would have done to us by wresting the gospel. But what needed all that joy for the death of Buckingham? Sith the times succeeding him have been so infinitely beyond him in all oppression, as they are like to bring all manner of miseries both upon king and people, so that in truth his Hydra's head being struck down, 100 more instead thereof appeared, which never durst in his lifetime. And as he got much by suits, so did Weston much by cheating, yet all came out of the subjects' purses, and Coventry, that so generally a reputed honest man, got such an estate by bribery and injustice, that he is said to have left a family worth 1,000,000, which may commend his wisdom, but in no wise his honesty. And now also dies Weston, after he had first brought in, as you may remember I told you himself was by Cranfield, Sir Thomas Wentworth, after Earl of Strafford, the active manager of the state and sole governor of the king. This Strafford, without doubt, was the ablest minister that this kingdom had since Salisbury's time. And to speak uprightly, there was not any but himself worthy of that name amongst all the king's council. Yet I am confident, by the weakness of that board, his abilities in state affairs were judged more than they were. And besides, that very word of statesman was now grown a stranger to our nation. Nor was he, as Salisbury or our ancient heroes, a general statesman, nor was it possible he should be, he not having that breeding himself, nor kept he any upon his charge in foreign parts for intelligence, nor had he such a tutor as the other had of his father, who was the most absolute statesman in the world, whose very papers, which were left to this Salisbury, and served as so many rich precedents and instructors to him, were able, if wanting in abilities of his own, to make him an able statesman. But I held Strafford's abilities to be more on this side than beyond the seas. Yet might he challenge the title of a good patriot, and so indeed he was before he turned a courtier. After that he converted his studies and endeavours to make the king an absolute arbitrary monarch, by screwing up the regal prerogative to so high a strain as hath made it crack, and by raising his revenues so high that he made them fall, in which also his own interest was concerned, for he did neither serve God nor the king for naught. Nor would Strafford's abilities have been so transparent had any such concurrents as Buckhurst, Walsingham, or Hatton been now living, or such an one as the Earl of Essex, who was Salisbury's antagonist. But this man had only the Archbishop, whose proper element too was but the Church, and they drew both in one line. And here I shall give you one note of Strafford's failing in his masterpiece, that he was no such absolute wise man, that could not find the just medium of the people's temper, but by striving to make the king all, and on a sudden he made the king less, and himself less than nothing. And had he been wise, he could not but find the king's spirit was not to undergo, nor to go through with great actions, but would fail under them, and crush the owners, which he, to his lamentable experience, hath found and felt too true. Besides, I much doubt Strafford's own spirit, that seeing his wisdom was too short to protect him, his spirit was so low to fail him, that he did not, like Samson, pull down the house upon others' heads, but fall, like a tame fool, himself alone, caught in a gin, and lay still without any fluttering, when surely some others of the Cabinet Council were as deep as himself in any design. You have here now seen a great subject, yea, the greatest that ever our eyes beheld, that was no favourite, and greater in his fortunes than many favourites. You have also seen a king, the greatest that our nation ever had, both in prerogative power and revenues, and the most absolute over his subjects. The one fallen below the earth, the other so low upon earth, that I wish I could but see him in the same state his peaceable father left him, who kept his prerogative to the height without cracking it, because he had able ministers and counsellors left, who were of Queen Elizabeth's stock. But this king's ministers strain all so high, that the very ligaments and nerves of sovereignty are quite broken in sunder. I wish them well sothered again. But because, if I write further, I must tune to a much lower key, I will here end with my prayers, that God would give the king a wise counsel, and an understanding heart, to be able to give himself counsel, what will be best for himself, his posterity, and the people committed to his charge, and that he may discern such as counsel him for their own private ends and interest, not for his honour and safety. And here do I draw a curtain betwixt the time past and that to come in this king's reign, desiring it may never be remembered to posterity. End of section 11. Section 12 of The Court and Character of King James, whereunto is now added the Court of King Charles, by Anthony Weldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Observations instead of a character upon this king from his childhood. It being improper to write the character of kings before their deaths, I wish this were not much nearer the period of his happiness than his death. Give me therefore leave to present unto your view some remarkable observations of this unfortunate king. In his very infancy he was so subject to that wilful humour still possessing him, that if anything crossed him he could hardly be stilled, which then they were forced to give way unto, by reason of that extreme weakness which disabled him, as the like did his father, until the 7th year of his age, to go, or scarce to stand, alone, crawling when of himself he would be in motion upon all four in a most unseemly manner. For the recovery whereof he was beholding to the skill of one Master Stuteville, an excellent artist for strengthening limbs and straightening crooked bodies, but for the rectifying his wayward disposition to the tender care of the Lady Carey, afterwards Countess of Monmouth. This humour of his principally he took from his mother, who, notwithstanding, was a gallant lady, nor was he free from it by the father's side, though his timorous nature gave it an allay. His mother, who loved him so dearly that she said she loved him as she did her soul, yet was wont to say that she must with grief of heart confess he was a fool and wilful, which would hereafter endanger him the loss of his crown. A sad censure, yet it should seem prophetical. But it were a lesson fit for all parents, learning rather to leave their children to God's providence than to pry into his office of foreknowledge. He ever expressed an ill nature by taking delight to do ill offices to his father's servants as well as to his own. Witness that instance concerning Master Murray his tutor, and Dr. Hackwell, placed about him to instruct him in the principles of religion, who, rightly judging it coincident to that his employment, did therefore, upon the treaty for the Spanish match, deliver him a small treatise in manuscript, therein intimating his advice and judgment to inform his conscience aright against coupling himself with a papist, saying to him, Sir, I beseech you make use of this by reading it yourself, but if you show it to your father, I shall be undone for my good will. The prince returned him many thanks, and assured him it should never go farther than the cabinet of his own breast. But withal he asked him to whom he had showed it. Hackwell replied, The Archbishop Abbot hath read it, who, returning him it, said to him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Besides him, he told the prince he had only showed it to Mr. Murray, the tutor, who, belike being better acquainted with his master's perfidious disposition than the other, did then dissuade him from delivering it to the prince, for, saith he will betray you. And it so fell out, for within less than 2 hours after his said engagement to the doctor, he presents it to his father, upon which he, or any through whose hands and cognizance it had passed before, were all under a disgrace and banished the court. Only Murray was afterwards provost of Eton. Here was an emblem of his breach of oaths and protestations in future, and of his untrustiness, which in a subject would have been called treachery. Such a one, too, he showed himself in the business of Rochelle, which, after his fair promises and deep imprecations for their relief and assistance, wherein they put some confidence, was merely betrayed by him, insomuch that when the Rochelle agents found themselves abused through their whole year's attendance, they left this bitter jeer upon him, that now they could rightly call England the land of promise. He seldom loved any but to serve his turn, and would himself serve a turn to do any mischief, as was to be seen by his saying Amen to every full point of Buckingham's accusation in the face of the Parliament against Bristol, for his miscarriage in Spain, when it appeared by Bristol's defence in public before the face of that same Parliament that there was not scarce one syllable had any truth in it, who also freely put himself upon the test that if there were any truth in that combined accusation against him, he would yield himself guilty of it all. He was of a very poor spirit, which may be conceived, amongst other things, by his making Buckingham his privado after he came to the crown. Otherwise would he never have forgotten those unsufferable insolences offered him being prince. What they were you have already heard. His predecessor Henry V, and so his brother Henry, would have instructed him otherwise. For although it's true noble minds should forget injuries so as not to revenge them, yet so as not to countenance the doers of them, especially to take them into so much nearness and dearness, as he did him after those two proud affronts which argued in him, as I said before, a poor and ignoble spirit. He had all his kingdoms left in peace and tranquillity by his father, which he soon after made a shift to distemper by a foolish war upon France and Spain, and by a more foolish conduct of either ignorant, unexperienced, or cowardly commanders. And in truth, if you will give credit to Vox Populi, the book so called, written by one Scott, they were suitable to the grounds of such quarrels, being no fairer than the satisfying the beastly appetite of his favourite, who must be revenged, forsooth, upon those states. In which I admire God's justice, that he who unjustly made war upon unwarrantable grounds should have war thus brought home unto him, so that now God hath given him the same measure he hath met to others, even full, pressed down, and running over. I wish I may have a time to give him a fairer character when he is dead, than are my observations in his life. But I may rather wish than hope in that course he yet continues. End of section 12.